Hi everyone, this is Ms. Cadena. This is a short lecture and review of Chapter 21, Section 5 that we did not get to read in class. Chapter 21, Section 5 is titled The Limits of Change. Our focus question for this section is, how did the New Deal benefits apply to women and minorities? So over the previous four sections, we talked about the election of 32 with the election of President Roosevelt, his first 100 days and the initiatives he launched during those first 100 days. And remember that the focus of Roosevelt's plan, which was called the New Deal, was relief. He needed to help people immediately. So he set to work in helping the banks, helping business, labor, wages, and giving people jobs. And unfortunately, some of his programs were found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and he tried to fix that by packing the court with his own supporters. And as we know, that did not go over very well. But then in the mid 1930s, with his re-election in 1936, he took that as a sign that he was kind of doing the right thing, that people approved of what he was doing. So he launched the second New Deal, which focused on security. So how do people secure themselves in their jobs, in their health, and to ensure that these kinds of things continue for people no matter what the economy is like. And of course, the biggest piece of legislation that comes from the Second New Deal is the Social Security Act of 1935, which of course we live with today. And there were other work programs that we learned about in the Second New Deal. The economy takes a little bit of a downturn after it makes an improvement, but then it begins to improve again. And so there are a lot of things that benefited people. Unfortunately, those benefits did not reach everyone. And as you can see here, women and minorities, by your focus question, did not reap all of those benefits. And so we're going to discuss that in this short review. So under that first section, the New Deal in American Women, we actually read this in class. And we talked about how Roosevelt had created the Second New Deal and its assistance plan to help broad groups of needy Americans. He wanted the Second New Deal to help the unemployed, the elderly, and the dependent. For example, dependent children, whether you're young or adults. And he linked these assistance. He linked them to citizenship, that Americans had a right to this security, to this assistance. It was not a special privilege. It was a right that as an American, you have a right to be secure in your person. But the realities of inherited ideas about gender, about African American disenfranchisement in the South, affected legislation. We read in class how purposefully in the South, state governments kept African Americans from reaping some of these benefits. They purposefully cut them out, leaving them in poverty. And so the New Deal affected different groups in very different ways. The New Deal incorporated women into government more than any other previous administration. We talked about how a number of talented women, such as Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, who is seen there in that picture, advised the presidents and affected policy. But the most well-known woman of the time period was Eleanor Roosevelt, who became the first modern First Lady. And she was modern in that she used her position as First Lady to go out into society and promote a special cause and use her position to call for change, to call for special programs, those kinds of things. And almost every First Lady from that time period we can link to a very special cause. We talked about in class how Nancy Reagan, who just passed away last week, her cause was say no to drugs. If you grew up in the 80s, you remember that. For Laura Bush, it was reading because she was a librarian. In modern times, Michelle Obama has kind of worked on two causes. One has been military families, but the biggest one has been nutrition and health for children. Healthier school lunches, getting kids to move, to exercise, those kinds of things. Which, interestingly enough, she's been criticized for, but we can talk about that later if you'd like. So Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady to do this, and she used her position for reform in civil rights, in labor laws, and in work relief. She was a very liberal person. But organized feminism was absent in the 1930s. That organized feminism that we talked about with Alice Paul and the Women's Temperance Christian Union and all these other groups. It was absent in the 1930s. And partly it's because women weren't necessarily, this wasn't the time period for women necessarily to want to fight for rights, because they were simply trying to survive, trying to find a job, trying to clothe and shelter and feed their kids. And the Depression had this kind of backwards effect on women in the labor market. We talked about how in the 20s more and more women, especially young single women, went out to the workforce. Well, the Depression actually provoked calls for women to leave the labor market. And it called for women to leave the labor market so that it would open up jobs for unemployed men. The federal government even enacted laws that led to the dismissal, the firing, the laying off of female government employees. And many private employers prohibited married women from jobs because they felt that if they were married and their husband was working, that would be enough to suffice, and they should save that job for someone else, for a man. Even the CIO, the labor union, which organized female workers, kind of followed those same ideas, those same notions that women should be supported by men. This ideal of the male-headed household powerfully shaped social policy, because paying taxes on wages made someone eligible for the most generous Social Security programs like old age pensions and unemployment insurance. They didn't cover most women because they didn't work outside the home. They never paid into those systems. And so the program wound up excluding 3 million mostly female domestic workers who were mostly paid in cash. So here's an image of Eleanor Roosevelt going into a mine in a mine car. So let's talk about the next two sections, the Southern Veto and the stigma of welfare. So although President Roosevelt tried to portray the federal government as a government that represented all people in America, the power of the Solid South molded the New Deal welfare state into an entitlement of white Americans. The power of the politicians of the South really shaped what the welfare program was going to look like, and they shaped it so it would benefit whites, that it was an entitlement. You're entitled to this because you are a white American. With black disenfranchisement, which means the lack of the voting power, because African Americans weren't allowed to vote, Democrats controlled the South. And Southern Democratic members of Congress were elected again and again by very tiny white minorities. Because committee chairmanships rested on seniority, Southerners, once the Democrats took control of Congress in 1933, took the key leadership positions. And this is how we're saying that because they were in those key positions, they were able to shape this legislation. Roosevelt believed he could not challenge the Southern Democrats if he wanted New Deal laws passed. He knew that if he wanted laws passed, he was going to have to compromise with them, even if that meant excluding African Americans. Southern Democrats excluded from Social Security agriculture, farm labor workers, and domestic workers. most of who were African Americans. Those were the largest categories of employment for African Americans. Only black organizations on the left, the liberal left, pushed for truly universal social insurance. Congressman Ernest Lundeen in Minnesota in 1935 had actually introduced a bill to create a federal system of old age unemployment and pensions, health benefits for all wage workers. And he wanted also support for female heads of households with dependents. But it was replaced by the Social Security bill, which again left out African Americans, or at least a large portion of them. Let's talk about the stigma of welfare. Because of this Southern veto, this kind of power that Southern politicians had to veto certain laws, most black workers were limited to the very least generous and most vulnerable parts of the new welfare state. Direct public assistance programs were ostensibly open to all poor seniors and families with dependent children who demonstrated financial need. But benefits were set low, and eligibility was determined by state and local officials who had very wide authority. These were the same officials who enacted segregation laws. So obviously, they were going to do whatever they could to keep African Americans out of that system. In the South, this translated into widespread discrimination. Because recipients of direct assistance did not pay Social Security taxes, they soon began to be put upon them this stigma of dependency on government handouts. And of course, this would simply become known as welfare. So it's very interesting that African Americans were looked down upon because they were dependent on government handouts, but it was that same government that made them dependent on it because it didn't give them any other choices. It didn't allow them to partake in Social Security. Okay? So these are all, I mean, think about even the issues we have today sometimes with welfare. These are issues we've created. Okay? I mean, we certainly can't blame everything that happens today on something that happened, 80 years ago. Things have changed. But there is a cycle, this kind of, as we talked about in class, generational poverty that can be hard to break. It can be very, very hard to break. And so this stigma of being dependent, of being on welfare, intensified. It got worse until pressure for reform led the federal government to abolish its responsibility for welfare in 1996 during the Bill Clinton administration. So this lasted all the way until 1996. So when we talk about the Clinton administration, and I believe in our second to the last chapter, we'll talk about that some more. So let's talk about how the New Deal affected Native Americans. The Depression and the New Deal had a contradictory impact on the nation's racial minorities. And one of those minorities would be Native Americans. Commissioner of Indian Affairs John C. Collier, who's in that image there, launched an Indian New Deal, which ended the policy of coerced assimilation. Okay, no more are we trying to force Native Americans to behave, to act like the white man. We're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to take their children away and put them in schools. Okay, that finally ended in the 1930s. This Indian New Deal also granted unprecedented cultural autonomy to these native tribes. In other words, they can keep their culture. There's no going to be anyone trying to tell them what to do as far as their culture is concerned. They had complete control over that. Collier replaced the boarding schools with reservation schools, and he increased spending on Indian health. He also ended the policy implemented since the Dawes Act of dividing Indian lands into small individual plots and selling off the rest. Federal officials now recognized the rights of Indians to govern their own communities, except in areas covered by federal law. And through the New Deal, even though the New Deal was the most radical shift in Indian policy in American history, it really did very little to improve living conditions on extremely poor reservations. It was almost a little too late, and more could have been done to help these communities. But they kind of ruined the communities and said, "Okay, guys, sorry what we did. You want to be in control of yourselves? Go for it. You're on your own." And now, what are they supposed to do? Okay, let's talk about Mexican Americans during this time period. Um, the Great Depression devastated Mexican Americans. 400,000 of them returned to Mexico because there was a decline in a demand for their labor. Some were coerced into moving by authorities in the Southwest. Maybe they were threatened to move back. But about 200,000 Mexican American children who were born in the United States and were citizens were also pressured to move to Mexico. Those who did stay to work worked in very desperate conditions on large corporate farms in the Southwest. The Wagner and Social Security Acts did not apply to agricultural workers, which means they did not collect any benefits. And when they tried to unionize, they were brutally suppressed. Mexican American leaders tried to develop a strategy to claim rights as white Americans because they were seen as white up until, well, they are considered white. They are Caucasian. But they also sought support from the Mexican government, who promoted this sense of pride, this kind of mystical sense of pride and identification with Mexican heritage. And that's going to take more and more shape up through the 1960s when people start using terms like La Raza and Chicano and Chicana and Brown Pride and the Brown Berets. That'll kind of really come to a head in the 1960s. And so here's an image of Mexican Americans waiting to leave Los Angeles in 1932 to go back to Mexico. Last hired, first fired. The one group of people who were always last hired and first fired were African Americans. They really suffered the most in the Great Depression. African Americans who were able to keep their jobs were now competing with unemployed whites. And people would rather have unemployed African Americans than unemployed whites. African Americans face an unemployment rate that was twice that of whites. African Americans benefited less from direct government relief, and they also benefited less from public works projects. The Depression forced many African Americans to make economic survival their primary concern. Even W.E.B. Du Bois surrendered his hopes for racial integration, and he urged African Americans to think of themselves of a nation within a nation. No one's taking care of you. No one's looking out for you, so we have to look out for ourselves. So think of yourselves this kind of separate group, separate nation within America. He urged African Americans to build independent, cooperative economy within their own communities and take control of separate schools. Let's just help ourselves. Okay? A new deal for African Americans, or a new deal for blacks. While Roosevelt seemed very little interested in race relations or in civil rights, because he was still racist, he did appoint Mary McLeod Bethune, the lady you see there, a well-known African American educator. He appointed her as his advisor on minority affairs, and he actually did appoint other African Americans to key positions. Because although he may have been racist, he wasn't stupid. He did know there were certain things he did need to do, and of course his wife helped and pressured him to do it. Key members of his administration, which included his wife and Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, criticized segregation. They criticized the lack of vote for African Americans, and they were very critical of lynching. African Americans generally supported the New Deal and started to vote for the Democratic Party. This is a shift, And it's a big shift because African Americans were very loyal to the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, the party that um, freed them from slavery. But because of the New Deal, they began to shift and vote more Democratic. And today, the majority of African Americans vote Democratic. They're huge supporters of Hillary Clinton right now. And they did this on the hopes that there would be broader changes that happened to be kind of um, stymied or slowed down by Southern Democrats and their influence in the party. So if we want to change the Democrats, let's become Democrats and change them from within. So this is where a lot of African Americans begin to shift over to the Democratic Party. Let's talk about federal discrimination, discrimination on a federal level. Federal housing policy very powerfully reinforced residential segregation and showed the limitations of New Deal freedom. Local officials implemented national housing policy in ways that reinforced existing racial discrimination. Nearly all municipalities in the states, in both North and South, insisted that housing that was sponsored by the federal government be racially segregated. The Federal Housing Administration also insured mortgages that contained clauses barring future sale to non-whites. So here we're talking about, again, the federal government supporting segregation. So if you wonder why the ghettos, why public housing happens to be mostly African American, this is why. It was the only place they could live. They were forced to live there. And even mortgage companies would put in their contracts that houses, they could not sell those houses to African Americans. So they were kept out of the suburbs and kept in the urban centers in the cities, in the ghettos. Okay. In the federal government, very few African Americans held skilled or professional positions. And in the South, many New Deal construction projects refused to hire African Americans. The New Deal's modernization of Southern agriculture led to landowners to kick off or kick out their tenant farmers, many of whom were African Americans. Only with the Great Society programs in the 1960s, 20-something years later, would the welfare state actually extend it to the point that African Americans would be included. But it was going to take another 25 years for that to happen under the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay? Okay, and that is the end of this section. If you have any questions, please do let me know.